As the eyes of the world powers fixate on Ukraine, Syria has entered its fourth year of civil war, with citizens recently facing the most deadly aerial bombardments yet. An estimated 150,000 people have died in the conflict, and almost half of the country's population has been displaced. Has the West done enough to stem the tide in Syria? Joining us now to help answer that, in Kingston, Ontario, Houchang Hassan-Yari. He is professor of comparative politics and international relations at the Royal Military College and a senior fellow at Queen's University. And here in studio, Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Janice, let's go to you first. I can remember doing programs with you 3 and 4 years ago where you said this isn't going to last very long and Assad's going to be out soon. Why has this lasted for 4 years?
You know, I was wrong. I really did not think in the first 6 to 9 months that he would survive this, Steve, but he has, in large part because Hezbollah intervened on the ground, and Iran has continued to provide the necessary finance and the military muscle that he needs. That turned the tide enough to create the horrific stalemate that we now have.
Houchang, why do you think this has now gone into its fourth year?
I believe at that point, a number of Iranian officials, they said that if Assad regime remains in power for seven months, he's going to be there forever. So it seems that they were almost, not entirely, almost right. The problem is, as Dr. Stein mentioned, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, but maybe more importantly, different groups really in Syria. First, those Syrians who fight the regime, they are weak, they are not very well armed. Those jihadists who moved to Syria from outside, they are not popular among the Syrians, and they don't really care about the situation in Syria per se or the Syrian population. What they are interested is to take power and to create a kind of Islamic system that they would like to. So combination of internal, external issues made it possible for Bashar Assad to remain in power.
Okay, let me get Janice Stein on that as well. How would you characterize all of the many different groups that are trying to get Assad out?
You know, Steve, we have over 1,000 armed groups operating in Syria now. The broad picture, we have 2 major political coalitions operating outside the country, poorly connected to the grassroots on the ground. The armed groups themselves are organized around the big cities, and in the northern areas, these revolutionary committees connect to political committees that are themselves not unified nationally. So what's really making this almost impossible is the poor relationship between those outside the country who claim to speak politically for the opposition and who are recognized by 17 major powers, and the grassroots political and military organizations on the ground who take orders from nobody and actually look with some contempt on the political operatives that are, they say, living the life of luxury outside the country.
Can you tell who, if anybody, has the upper hand at this moment?
Well, certainly when you have a conflict like this that goes on, you empower the more radical elements. And the Islamists have done relatively well. So organizations like the Nusra Front, the Islamic Council in Syria and in the Levant, or in Iraq, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, it's the same group. These at least cohere and can speak with some efficacy. Those who originally led the opposition, who started the armed insurrection against Bashar al-Assad, they are now weak, fragmented, as alarmed by the Islamists as they are by the Assad regime. So they find themselves now between a rock and a hard place.
So, Houchang, would you agree that Assad has the upper hand even 4 years into this thing?
I believe so. If you look at the territories that recently the government forces they took from the different groups, it shows clearly that the Assad regime is gaining the new territories, more power, and consequently they are in a better shape than they, let's say, they were last year. The other issues related to this is the fact that the extremist Islamic groups who took over a number of cities and towns, villages in Syria, they treated the people so badly that they, everybody fears them really. So this is why they cannot be successful. If we add to this real issue the infighting, what's going on among those groups, for example, the ISIS, very extremist elements, Salafis, Wahhabis, and then when they fight the other group, Nusra group, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda, we realize that this infighting can only serve the Assad regime, and consequently the opposition groups or armed groups, they are losing territory in favor of the regime, and also frankly the fact that Assad is enjoying immense backing from Hezbollah Iranians directly, that helps them, because we are talking about a very formidable force of Hezbollah, a country, Iran, that a few decades ago came out of war, 8 years of war with the Iraqis, very well prepared, very well armed, and on top of all of that, you have the Russian arms pouring into Syria. So all of these elements make it much more positive for the regime than the other side.
Let me jump in at this point if I can. Let me jump in at this point if I can to focus on chemical weapons. It looked like, Janice, that there was some kind of an agreement in place to remove the chemical stockpiles away from this regime. How has that in fact gone?
So here's the record, Steve. 80% of those chemical weapons are out. And that piece of the story is extraordinary, frankly. To be able to, first of all, to dismantle the production systems, which they did in a period of 6 to 8 weeks, and then to ship out through a war zone to ships at sea chemical weapons, and to degrade them and to dismantle them. This is one of these bright stories that we don't pay enough attention to.
So that's the good news.
Yeah, now he's behind on the last shipment, and there's still 13% to go. But that's a good news story. Now, what we all saw last week or the last few weeks was the use of chlorine gas. In a part of Syria, chlorine gas was not on the list of banned chemical weapons that he was forced to declare. And we saw, so this tells you this is an unrepentant Bashar al-Assad. With a knife to his throat, he gave up the chemical weapons because he assured his own survival. But he feels no compunctions against using any kind of weapons, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, household chemicals, against civilians.
You mentioned barrel bombs, and I want to just pick up on that, because here from the BBC News from just a few days ago is the following. A description of the barrel bombs. Barrel bombs are just what their name implies. Yeah. Large, cylindrical metal containers filled with explosive and shrapnel that are typically rolled out of the door of a helicopter. They were initially dropped from a low altitude, which afforded a reasonable degree of accuracy. But the possession of portable surface-to-air missiles by the rebels has forced the helicopters higher, and any accuracy has disappeared. Despite being rudimentary weapons, their destructive power is considerable, though they are only one part of a Syrian government's arsenal that has been employed against civilian areas, and their use could well constitute a war crime. Now, we have video of this as well. This is a clip filmed by rebels in southern Damascus. This is back in January, showing what appear to be barrel bombs being dropped by the government into rebel-held areas. And let's just watch this video for a bit. Just recently, of course, you may have seen in the news that one of these barrel bombs hit a school and killed dozens of kids.
Horrific.
And there is the video, and there is the aftermath of what a barrel bomb can do.
So it's, you know, this is in warfare in the 21st century. You don't really need to import much You need attack helicopters. You create these weapons at home. They're relatively inexpensive to create. Some of the opposition now has anti-aircraft missiles, which they've been asking for 3 years from the United States. Some of those missiles are now beginning to reach the opposition. As a result, Steve, the helicopters are flying higher. They're less accurate. So the barrel bombs are doing more damage than they did before.
Houchang, I have to ask you to characterize a government that uses these kinds of weapons against civilians. What do you think?
If you look at the history of the Assads and the Ba'athist regime in Syria since 70s, we realize that this regime is a very brutal, really, regime. They tried in the past all means at their disposal to remain in power. And what's going on now, unfortunately, for those victims of the attacks, this is just part of the rationale of this government. The way that this government stays in power is really to do whatever it takes. And so this is why they use the weapons that they prepared themselves to use against the Israelis. Imagine. Now they use the same weapons, the planes, helicopters, tanks, and whatever it takes in order to retake the control of the country. So we should not be surprised because this is the nature of the regime. And the regime, since there is no cohesion among the opposition groups on one hand, and on the other, Saudis, Turks, Americans, and others who at some point they wanted to intervene in Syria in favor of the Syrian people or the Syrian opposition. None of them are moving in that direction, and this really gives a very clear sign to the Assad regime that they can do whatever they want, and there is no desire, there is no appetite in the West, in the region, for intervening against the Assad regime. And then the other question related to this is really Assad made it absolutely clear for the international community that the alternative to its regime, this regime is going to be a barbaric, Islamist, and very, very harsh governments that is going to threaten the entire region. So at least the Americans and others, they continue to be content with this situation, the limited, really, warfare going on in Syria. There is no real impact, although Lebanon and to some extent Jordan and Turkey are impacted, but the impact in other countries is very, very limited. So why not leave the Syrian regime to solve the problem? And
okay,
that's
amidst
the
all of
sad
that,
part of the situation.
Amidst all of that, they're going to have an election. On June the 3rd, Janice, they have decided to hold a presidential election. How do you have an election with a country in chaos?
Let me tell you, Steve, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the Ontario election.
Thank God for that.
Exactly. So it's a travesty to attempt to hold an election under these conditions. Civilians are not secure. Polling booths are not secure. The only elections that have ever been held in Syria, the Assad family has won by 99.96%.
And they want the names of the 0.4% that didn't vote for them.
And they want the names of the 4%. What they've done this time, for the record, as they say, is they've changed the legislation to allow more parties to identify, and what one would call proxy parties have emerged. 7 candidates have declared themselves candidates for the presidency. Most Syrians would not know the names of 5 of these, and were I a betting woman, I would tell you that Bashir will win with 99% of the vote this time.
Do the opposition figures have any access to television
Absolutely
or campaigning?
Not. No. Absolutely not. And again, you showed us the video. The level of insecurity in the major cities, many of them are under aerial bombardment, artillery bombardment by the Assad regime. This actually, for me, will polarize relationships even further between the government and the opposition party. It's a poison pill, frankly.
Houchang, briefly, if you would, because I do want to touch on one more thing after this. How legitimate in your eyes do you think this election can be?
Is as legitimate as the Assad regime is. So you cannot really get better than that. No, it's not going to be legitimate for a number of reasons. First of all, in the middle of a war, you don't really organize elections. Secondly, who guarantees the health of this election? Nobody is going to be able to do that. And on top of all of that, Bashar Assad is organizing this election just as a cosmetic, really, gesture for the international community to be happy that something is going on in that direction. But we cannot really expect any surprise in this election because in a country like Syria, before that in Iraq and other countries in the region, we used to get a very, very high percentage of votes in favor of the presidency in exercise, and like Soviet Union in the past. So it's not serious, simply.
It's not serious. Okay, with a few minutes left here, I want to touch on one more thing, and that is to draw a comparison. I hope this isn't considered too snarky in doing this, but to draw a comparison between the Canadian response to Ukraine. We have imposed sanctions. We have 6 CF-18 Hornets on the way there. We have the HMCS Regina on the way there to assist in what's happening in Ukraine. By comparison, we're not doing anything in Syria.
No, we're not doing anything militarily.
Militarily, okay, in Syria. The situation in Syria is on a scale of magnitude wholly different from what's happening in Ukraine. Not to minimize what's happening in Ukraine, but the amount of carnage in Syria is completely above and beyond what we've seen in Ukraine. Janice, why the two different responses?
I mean, you're absolutely right, Steve. There's no comparison between civilian casualties, dead, killed, wounded, disruption, use of weapons. They are off the scale in Syria in comparison to anything that's happened in Ukraine. Why are we doing nothing? Let's look back at the last 15 years. The so-called international community, which really means the rich developed world, sent forces to Iraq, and the violence in Iraq to this day has not really abated as a result. Afghanistan, very similar kind of experience. There is, I think, a well-deserved reluctance now to intrude foreign forces into what is a violent civil war because there's a sober-minded appreciation that it could make it worse rather than better.
But we don't seem to be following that advice vis-a-vis Ukraine.
So what's the one successful intervention we've had in the last 35 years? It's in Bosnia, where massive numbers of troops were introduced into a European context. They knew the terrain, they understood the rules. The gaps were not that great in terms of the way people operated. So there's a greater willingness to take a risk, I think.
Houchang, we've got about a minute left. Let me get your view on why the differing responses.
I don't want to be cynical, but there is not much oil in Syria. The Syrian situation is extremely difficult. Nobody is willing really to go there and engage the soldiers and the capabilities in that country. The question is, since the conflict is under control somehow, so why should the others intervene? I can add to this the fact that there is no real danger for Israel, for example, and that remove any possibility of intervention by the Israelis or Americans. The Europeans are not interested in intervening after Afghanistan, the Americans after Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. All that to say that the Syrians are the neglected, really, people in the world, and they are discriminated against. I would say that the Americans and others, including the Canadians, could do a better job when all of that started, but they didn't do that, and they created a situation where now everybody is happy, really, for the Assad regime to remain in power, because again the alternative is going to be a nightmare for all. So the Islamist groups, if they take over, that would be a real threat for the international security. the Arab countries, rich Arab countries, very friendly to the Western countries. So Syrians, we can tolerate 100,000 to 100,000 deaths, half of the population displaced, but there is no interest to get involved here. This is, I would characterize it somehow by discrimination and lack of interest in not significant countries and not significant people.
I want to thank both of you for your analysis on this tonight. Thanks so much to Houchang Hassan-Yari, the professor at RMC, senior fellow at Queen's University, and Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T. My thanks to you both.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.